the brain. 30 billion neurons, trillions of connections, and all of this fits in our skull. But what if it knows more about us than we do? Natalia Bekhtereva, the same one who peered into the depths of human consciousness with a scalpel and fearlessness, once said, "We think that we are studying the brain, but it may be studying us." Well, how else can her ideas be explained? They stood out from the orderly ranks of academic science, like unruly sparks they burned, caught, made us argue. She talked about the brain as if it were not just an organ, but a living interlocutor, capricious, unpredictable, sometimes frighteningly wise. And here's what's strange. Years later, her heretical thoughts are confirmed. Either science has matured, or the brain has finally begun to open up to us. Bekhtereva couldn't stand comparisons of the brain with a computer. Well, here we go again with these endless analogies, neurons as processors, memory as a hard drive, synapses as the wires of the system. In the laboratories of the 60s, they loved such metaphors. It was convenient. Everything was in its place. And she winced, as if from a bad smell. "Explain to me then," she said, tapping her pencil on the table, "where in my skull is the déjà vu button, or the unit responsible for that very melody that haunts me in the morning?" Colleagues shrugged their shoulders like, "Natalia Petrovna, well, this is just a figurative comparison." And she exploded. "Can you imagine the impudence to reduce 30 billion neurons to a children's construction set?" And she gave an example. Here is a patient after a stroke. By all computer standards, the system has failed, the data is corrupted, and he suddenly begins to draw brilliant pictures with his left hand, although before the illness he held the pencil crookedly. Where are your algorithms here? She was especially annoyed by expressions like the brain processes information. "Processes it?" she mimicked. "Maybe it also pickles it like cucumbers." For her, the brain was not a cold processor, but something like an ocean, with tides, underwater currents, sudden storms. Try to predict a wave, will it work? Well, the same story with the brain. Living things do not break down into patterns, she would throw out at the end of arguments, and she would add more quietly, as if to herself, "And if they do break down, then we are missing something very important." But it's true, just try to program intuition. Here sits a programmer scribbling code around the clock. He can write the most complex algorithms, train neural networks. But as soon as he tries to code that very inner feeling that suddenly whispers, "Don't get on this plane," and that's it. Stupor. How to write goosebumps down your spine in binary code. How to translate into Python the moment when a solution comes in a dream. The brain, it does not just make mistakes, it makes brilliant mistakes. Here's an example. Mendeleev's table appeared in a dream. The chemist spent weeks slaving over the systematization of the elements, and the answer came in a moment of half-asleep oblivion. Modern computers can calculate millions of combinations in seconds, but no artificial intelligence has yet repeated this trick with insight. And these strange glitches of our neural network? When you suddenly forget the name of an old friend, but remember the smell of his cologne, when a memorized formula flies out of your head during an exam, but your hand itself comes up with the solution, as if someone was dictating it from within. Bekhtereva loved such incidents. "You see," she said, "your computer freezes, that's the end. And when the brain freezes, that's often the beginning of some kind of breakthrough." She gave examples from practice. Patients with damaged areas of the brain who suddenly began to hear music in the noise of the rain or see faces in random spots. "We call it hallucinations," she grinned. "Or maybe it's just the brain, having thrown off its limitations, showing us what it always knew how to do, but was afraid to turn on in normal mode." And indeed, all these errors and failures look much more interesting than the trouble-free operation of hardware. One neurosurgeon once admitted, "When you open the cranium, you expect to see something like a complex mechanism. But there's just some kind of mush. And the most amazing thing is that this mush composes poetry and invents bicycles." So the next time your internal computer gives you something strange, don't rush to reboot. Maybe it's not a bug, but a feature that Bekhtereva has been trying to figure out her whole life. She literally seethed. Can you even imagine the impudence of trying to pack 30 billion living pulsating neurons into a primitive children's construction set? Her eyes would flash at such moments, as if they reflected all those unexplored depths of the brain that she spoke about so passionately. "You're not going to claim," her voice would acquire a dangerous softness, "that the Sistine Chapel is simply a successful combination of colours on a canvas?" And then she would give a damning example. "Here is a patient. The right hemisphere is damaged by a stroke according to your computer logic. It is as if a whole cluster of hard drives fell off the server. The data should be lost, right? But what do we see instead?" She liked to tell about one of her charges, an accountant who, before his illness, had only held a pencil in his hands to fill out invoices. And after the stroke, this man, Bekhtereva's voice trembled with indignation, suddenly began to paint pictures with his left hand that gave art historians goosebumps. Where in your algorithms is this function written? If block A is damaged, genius in block B is automatically activated. A pause. A challenging look. Well, where are your precious bits and bytes that can explain why the destruction of one part of the system suddenly opens up abilities in another part that were not even suspected? And indeed, how can we explain the phenomenon of savants from a computer point of view? Or the sudden awakening of a musical genius after a traumatic brain injury? Bekhtereva sarcastically noted, "Your favourite artificial intelligence can beat a person at chess, but no program can forget an email password and suddenly write a Shakespearean sonnet." Her cyberneticist colleagues would fidget in their chairs with displeasure at such moments, and she would already pull out new stories about patients whose brain damage opened access to incredible mathematical abilities, or, conversely, forced them to perceive the world as a continuous stream of poetic metaphors. The brain is not a system with clear if-then, she concluded, wearily rubbing her temples. It is a living ocean where the destruction of one current can unexpectedly create another. And while you are trying to disassemble it into gears, it continues to pose riddles before us, before which all your algorithms pale. And after half a century, when neural networks have learned to imitate creativity, her words sound even more provocative. Yes, AI can generate paintings in the style of Van Gogh, but can it, having damaged a neuron, suddenly start painting like Dali? That is the question. Colleagues rolled their eyes when Bekhtereva started talking about prophetic dreams. "Natalia Petrovna, enough of this mysticism," grumbled the venerable academics, and she methodically wrote down another case in a thick notebook. A patient who saw her brother's death in a dream 3 days before the telegram. She was especially fascinated by the phenomenon of déjà vu. "Why are we sure that this is just a memory failure?" she asked, going through stories of people who remembered places they had never been. Maybe the brain catches someone else's signal at such moments. Behind the scenes, she was already called a scientific psychic, but Bekhtereva only grinned. You study the brain through a microscope, and it may have long been connected to something that your microscope does not see. Once she conducted a risky experiment. She recorded the EEG of people who claimed to see the future. When colleagues saw strange bursts of activity in the temporal lobes, someone muttered, "Equipment artifacts." Bekhtereva silently handed them a printout, identical artifacts in 5 different subjects. "I do not believe in the supernatural," she said, "but I must believe the facts. And the facts say, our brain knows more than it should." Hundreds of unexplained cases remained in her archives. Like that patient with a completely destroyed hippocampus, who nevertheless remembered events that he could not have known. "What if memory is not stored in neurons?" she wrote in her diary. "What if the brain is just an antenna, not a hard drive?" The scientific community was angry. "You are undermining the foundations," her opponents shouted. Bekhtereva shrugged her shoulders. "The foundations must sometimes tremble, otherwise it is not science, but dogma." Before her death, she confessed to her assistant, "We have been looking for consciousness inside the skull all our lives, but it may have been outside." She was interrupted by a coughing fit. She did not have time to finish her thought. This thought of Bekhtereva's exploded the academic community like a grenade in a quiet reading room. "Schizophrenia is the price for giftedness." This phrase from her lips sounded like a sentence to the entire system of psychiatric dogmas. At the academic council, she was literally besieged. "Are you justifying mental disorders? This is a direct path to stigmatization of creative people." And she calmly laid out the medical records of geniuses in front of her opponents. Here is Van Gogh with his Starry Nights, written in between attacks. Dostoevsky, whose epileptic auras gave the world the insights of Prince Mishkin. Newton, who in moments of exacerbation of the disorder derived his laws. "Do you see sick people here?" she asked. "And I see people whose brains paid a terrible price for access to other dimensions of thought." She was especially struck by the case of mathematician John Nash. Colleagues considered him crazy until he received the Nobel Prize, Bekhtereva noted. "I wonder what would have happened if he had been cured before the discovery." Her archives contained a study of 47 patients diagnosed with schizophrenia who possessed phenomenal abilities. One could calculate the roots of 20-digit numbers in his head. Another could draw exact copies of a city he had seen once. A third could predict solar flares to the hour. "Where is the line?" she asked rhetorically. "Between hallucination and insight, between delirium and prophecy. The brain of a genius is always a minefield, where every deviation can be both a symptom and a door to the unknown." She ended her most controversial lecture provocatively. "When the next madman comes to you with delusional ideas, maybe you should first check if he is a genius. History shows that psychiatrists have often been more wrong than their patients." The hall froze. Someone indignantly slammed the door. But several young doctors remained with eyes full of new questions. This was the whole point of her daring hypothesis: to make science doubt its own criteria of norm. After all, if it is true that genius and madness are neighbours in the neural network, then who are we doctors, or, God forbid, censors of evolution? Bekhtereva's own brain became her last and most astonishing experiment. When at the age of 76, a stroke twisted the left hemisphere, the doctors just threw up their hands. Too extensive damage, too venerable an age. in the best case elementary speech and basic self-care, concluded the luminaries of neurology. But they did not take into account one thing: their patient's name was Natalia Petrovna Bekhtereva. The first months were truly a nightmare. The scientist who had studied speech all her life now could not remember the word cup. Her famous logic, the same one that shattered academic dogmas to smithereens, could no longer cope with the simplest conclusions. And then the inexplicable happened. Slowly, with titanic effort, her brain began to rebuild, not just restore lost functions, find new paths. When the destroyed speech centers refused to work, some previously silent zones were activated. "You won't believe it," she whispered to her assistant, finding it difficult to find the words. "But sometimes, now I feel thoughts, more clearly than before the damn stroke." Her speech really did change. Complex terms and multi-layered constructions disappeared. Some kind of crystal simplicity appeared, almost childish spontaneity, but at the same time a deadly precision of formulations. "I used to speak in a complicated way because I was afraid," she once admitted. "I was afraid that I would not be understood. Now I have nothing to lose, and the words come by themselves, the right ones, the right ones." The most amazing moment came when she, already seriously ill, gave her last interview. The journalist asked, what is the most important thing she learned in 60 years of studying the brain? Bekhtereva fell silent. Not because she could not speak, she was looking for the only right word. Then she said quietly, "Mystery." And she explained, stretching out the words, "We think that we are deciphering the brain, and it just allows us to peek a little." That evening, her monitors showed strange activity in the right temporal lobe where, according to all textbooks, there should not have been speech centers. The nurses called the doctor on duty, but by the time he arrived, the graphs had already calmed down. And Bekhtereva slept with a slight smile, as if she had finally seen what she had been looking for so long. Her last entries in her diary are especially mysterious. What if the stroke did not damage my brain, but freed it, retired the old hackneyed neural pathways and gave a chance to new ones? And below, in trembling handwriting, "We study the brain in its usual state. Or maybe its true nature is revealed precisely when it is broken." So who controls whom after all? We control our brain or it controls us? Bekhtereva, it seems, never gave a clear answer. Maybe she shouldn't have. In her laboratories, the screens of encephalographs flickered, recording bursts of electrical activity. And sometimes she turned off the equipment and simply asked patients, "What are you feeling now?" Because no graphs can convey this strange, irrational human. That which makes us suddenly fall silent looking at the sunset, or wake up in the middle of the night with a ready-made solution that has been eluding you for weeks in your right mind. The last notes of the 80-year-old Bekhtereva are striking, not in their scientific rigor, but in their courage. Maybe death is just a transition of consciousness to another form. A scientist, a philosopher, or just a tired woman who knew too much about the brain to believe in final truths. And your brain right now, is it analyzing these lines? Or is it experiencing something? When they touch